Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a kind of ordinary desktop corporate build and we're going to make something really cool out of it. And the reason that we're going to do this is because ASUS called me up and they said, hey, Patrick, do you want to look at one of our Pro motherboards, and specifically a B660M-C D4-CSM motherboard, which is a very, very long name, but the big things that you need to know here are that this is part of ASUS's Pro line, so it is meant for things like corporate desktop PCs, kind of really more of that, not really a gamer, it's more of a commercial motherboard. And the other thing is that CSM is the corporate stable model. And what that practically means is a whole bunch of things that are geared really towards kind of an IT organization. And that's a lot different than what I think a lot of folks really see an ASUS motherboard as. And so I really thought like, hey, let's go do that. And just a really fun note, when ASUS called me up and said like, hey, do you want to go do this? Something that I looked back, I was like, I think we've done CSM motherboards in the past, haven't we? Like, haven't we done a bunch of them? And it turns out we have, but it looks like that the last one that I did was actually in 2013 for the STH main site. So it was basically a motherboard review that we did, I think like 8 or 9 years ago. We actually did a little series on CSM, but that's a long time, right? So there are definitely some things that have changed, and actually really interesting changes since then. So we're gonna talk a little bit about some of the changes from the last time that I did a CSM motherboard review, because I think it's kind of cool. With that, let's get to the hardware. And specifically, this is an MATX motherboard. So it's not a full ATX size. It's also not an MITX. So it is, you know, kind of that in-betweener 9x6 by 9x6 size. And what that practically means is that you can put it in smaller chassis. Now, you're definitely gonna have noticed that we did not put this in a small chassis, and I'm gonna explain why when we get to the build, but for now, it is a MATX, and that means it will work in a bunch of different types of systems. The big feature is that we get the LGA 1700 and also the B660 chipset. This is an Alder Lake, so for the Intel Alder Lake series processors, which is the 12th generation Intel Core processors. Next to the socket, you're gonna see that we get a total of 4 DIMM slots. These are actually DDR4 DIMM slots, not DDR5. Now, a lot of folks are gonna say, hey, if it's Alder Lake, why are you not using DDR5? And the big reason is just frankly, in a lot of the business kind of settings, like if you're doing office work, you have like, you're making PowerPoints all day and this is your system to go do that, or like if you have a enterprise like ERP or something like that, and you just kind of need to go around in web pages and things like that, you just frankly don't need things like, you know, DDR5 that add all that extra expense. And so this is an area where they actually save that cost. And by saving the cost, it kind of made the motherboard, I guess, more reasonable in terms of price. We're gonna get to price in a little bit, but there's also a lot more than just the actual physical hardware that is going on here. And I wanna get to that when we actually cover that. But for now, that's just kind of a difference that we do have DDR4 here. In terms of expansion, we get a PCIe Gen 4 by 16 slot and then 2 by 1 slots. Those by 1 slots, by the way, are PCIe Gen 3. Now you may be saying like, hey, wait, this is Gen 4 and like Alder Lake supports Gen 5. What the heck is going on here? And really, again, this is just one of those places where, frankly, you know, people aren't putting PCIe Gen 5 devices like into systems like this very often. And so it's just one of those things that I think ASUS said, yeah, we could do that, but it would cost way more, so we're not gonna do that for this. You do also, though, get 2 PCIe Gen 4 by 4 M.2 slots, so if you want to go do things like put SSDs in there, you can totally go do that. And there's also a M.2 slot that is specifically for Wi-Fi, and so you can put a Wi-Fi module in there and get Wi-Fi. Something that I kind of wish that this motherboard had was, I wish kind of had it like at least Wi-Fi 6, so an Intel, I think it's like AX 2000, 2001. You know, I think that would have been good, if not the AX 210, but still just having Wi-Fi on board, I think is actually a pretty nice value add, especially in a corporate setting. I can kind of understand why they went with the M.2 option, but at the same time, I think that, you know, it's 2022, that would have been a nice thing to have. Now, something that I didn't know, but I actually learned while we were doing this review, is that if you look at the bottom portion of the motherboard, a lot of these connectors for things like comm slots or where the audio is and all those kind of things that are on this bottom part of the motherboard, ASUS actually keeps that kind of port configuration the same through different generations. So that way, if you have like a signature chassis that you are using, you know exactly the cable lengths, you know everything that you need to be able to go and use their motherboards, I guess, in different generations of systems. It also means that if you had to go and replace an older motherboard and replace it with a new one because maybe something failed or you know, you just need an upgrade or whatever it is, you can actually just pull the old motherboard out. You'll be able to put the new motherboard and, you know, any other components like processors and stuff that you need in, and then you'll be able to just go hook up things and you won't have to go like change out a chassis or anything like that. You'll be able to actually go do that service. So it's just another little thing in the CSM model, and these are the kind of things that I think are just a little bit different. One other bit that's a little bit different is if you look at the B660 chipset heatsink, it's darn small. If you were to go compare that to something like a motherboard that you would see on like the consumer side, you would definitely notice that there is a ton less ornate heat sinks and stuff that are all over this thing. I mean, this definitely looks a lot simpler than some of the crazy gaming motherboards that ASUS has. Also, it doesn't have things like RGB. So this is definitely something that looks more like a corporate motherboard than something that you would put in like a gaming system that you wanted to go and, you know, stream with or like stream and show people. This is definitely doesn't have that ornamentation. It doesn't look pretty. And it's also not really, I mean, it's technically will support K-series processors, but realistically, most folks are gonna just use like 65 watt TDP or lower CPUs in a platform like this because, well, that's just kind of what corporate users use, right? That's what it is. And so we're actually building with the Core i5-12500, and that's kind of what we're gonna be using as our base processor for this build. Also, I just will note that this does have TPM, and you can use it says you can use the discrete or the firmware TPM, so you have options if you want to go do Windows 11 and you need that TPM support, or Windows 10 if you need TPM as well. This totally has that. One small thing that I wish that this motherboard had that it doesn't, but I'm going to show you why it's going to be important in a little bit, is the fact that there's only 3 4-pin PWM fan headers on here. Specifically, there's one for the CPU, and then there are 2 additional headers on the motherboard. Why that matters is because if you have a chassis that has, say, 3 fans in it, why that matters is that if you are building this in too large of a chassis that's like way too big for the actual system that you've put together, not naming any names on who's about to go do that, but if you were doing that, you may have a chassis that has, say, 3 or more fans, and this, you know, if you have the heatsink fan on the processor, well, you know, you basically only have 2 for a chassis fan, so if you have 3 fans, you're just kind of hosed. And so we ended up working around that, and I'll show you how in a little bit, but that is something that we did have to work around. Okay, so putting the system together, I just kind of put together something that would be something that if somebody asked me to just go build a pretty basic PC that somebody really wasn't trying to like game on, but it's just kind of like a basic office PC, this is basically what I would do with the system, right? I'd probably put that Core i5-12500 in there, and I would use the stock heatsink because frankly, spending something like $70, $80 for a fancier heatsink for something that's a 65 watt TDP CPU, I mean, you can totally go do that, but in the corporate market, people aren't going to want to go do that because it's just a lot of extra cost, and the box heatsink is basically very inexpensive to get. In terms of memory, this is one that I definitely splurged on. We are putting in 2 DIMMs because I always kind of believe, especially if you have integrated graphics, in filling both channels of memory. And frankly, here's basically what happened. These Patriot memory modules, they were on sale and they were 32 gigs, and I personally don't like smaller than, like, deploying less than 32 gig DIMMs anymore. And so I was like, well, you probably would just do 2 8 gig or maybe 2 16 gig DIMMs, but this is a place that I'm definitely going to splurge, and you're gonna see a little bit more about that on why in a little bit. But that we do have 64 gigabytes of memory in those 2 DIMMs. Now on the SSD side, we're just using a Sabrent, PCIe Gen 3, actually 1 terabyte drive. PCIe Gen 4, typically, they are run a lot hotter than the PCIe Gen 3 drives, and frankly, for office tasks, most people just aren't gonna notice. The other thing was that I actually had this SSD sitting around, and it was unopened, and it was just sitting there, and I was like, well, we're gonna be using that because it's a corporate desktop PC, so good. But overall, putting this entire thing together only takes a couple of minutes. You pop the processor in, plop down the heatsink, put the DIMMs in, and then put your SSD on. And once you've done that, all you basically need to do is hook it up to a power supply and a chassis and all the fans and stuff, and you are ready to go. And that's it. So if anybody says that building a desktop PC is hard, just remember, you don't even need to like cable up hard drives and SSDs and stuff anymore. You literally just put them on the motherboard, everything plugs into the motherboard. It is super easy. Now, for the chassis, we are using the Fractal Node 304. And I personally like the look of the Fractal Node 304, and that is probably the reason that we got it. But the other reason is because I wanted to go and build something that's a little bit bigger and a little bit kind of more robust, and I didn't want to change the chassis because that's just a pain. So I would definitely say that if you're building a corporate desktop PC, don't get something this big. This is way too big for a system like this, but it is only just because we're gonna use the expansion capabilities later when we make this thing super cool. And basically, the installation was super easy. You hook up the front panel connectors, you hook up the fans, you hook up the power supply, and you're basically ready to go. One thing though that I do wish that ASUS had on these motherboards is that they still use a kind of separate IO faceplate for the IO shield. I kind of wish that they did something like they do on a lot of their gaming motherboards, where they actually kind of affix that shield to the motherboard itself. It just would make the installation process a little bit faster, not a huge amount, but it would probably take another 2-3 minutes less. And I think that that is something that would be valuable. So I just kind of hope that one day ASUS actually does bring that to the CSM line. And yeah, so basically once that was done, we tried installing Windows 10 Pro. We totally did that, no problem. We also installed Windows 11 Pro, and of course we fully licensed the stuff using the OEM system builder licenses, and we were able to even do the upgrade from Windows 10 to Windows 11 Pro. So it is something that, we definitely checked out. We tried both OSs and it definitely worked. We also had Ubuntu Linux working in this, and so if you want to, you could totally go run Linux on this thing as well. Although you do probably have to go play with a little bit of security settings. I think we had to play with a couple of them to be able to get Linux installed, but overall, you can totally go do it. A couple things though that I do want to note is that when you're in the BIOS, something that you're going to notice that is very different is the fact that this BIOS looks more kind of like a server BIOS, I guess, rather than looking like a consumer desktop gaming motherboard BIOS. So there's definitely something that is completely different just in the look and feel. Feels very familiar for us because we do a lot of servers, but if you were doing only gaming PCs, you'd be like, wow, this looks kind of different. And that is a little bit of a difference since 2013 when we last did the CSM motherboards. They actually basically used the gaming BIOS, and so it looked like a gaming motherboard when you went into it back then, but now it definitely looks a little bit different. Now ASUS says that it uses premium components on this motherboard and does things like has a water resistant surface thing. I didn't try spilling water on it because I didn't want to break it and then not be able to actually do this thing. But they say that they have high quality components, and so that's something to note in the CSM model. The other thing that they do, which is a little bit different from the consumer side, is they actually guarantee a 36-month life cycle and then give a 6-month kind of end of support thing. And that's that notice is really important, and I'll tell you why. Probably it may not be the exact next video, but one of the next videos in the next week and a half or so after this video is actually going to be a system that we reviewed. And when we did the system review, the system was only out for like a total of 6 months. We got it about month 4. And then by the time we were done with our review process, it turns out that it's like 6 months later, you can't even buy the thing anymore because it's not available and it's not being made. So why that matters is that like if you're trying to go and sell a system to one of your customers and then they really like that system, like, hey, I want some more, like, oh, well, I can't get that motherboard anymore. I can't get that. Like what am I gonna do? And then your customer says, cool, so are you gonna give me a discount on the new one, or am I gonna go to one of your competitors? And you have to have that whole conversation. And you just don't wanna do that, which is why CSM is kind of nice. Also, folks just like to have the exact same components and be able to order the same motherboards, have the same components available, so that way you can go and service things, like how systems are going to behave and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing when we get back to the BIOS is the fact that there's an entire BIOS kit. So you can do things like you could go and customize the logos. You can do things like you can hide different BIOS options so that the users can't get into it. And I think you can also use it to go do the OEM activation. So like have the OEM activation licenses actually in the BIOS like you would on some other systems. So there are a whole bunch of different things that you actually get with the CSM platform that you don't necessarily get with a kind of basic consumer motherboard. And that's really, I think, what a lot of the value is to this thing. You're gonna say like, hey, it doesn't look as cool as gaming motherboards, but the reason for that is that it's not trying to be cool, it's trying to provide those kind of like business focused features. The other thing that ASUS has that I really want to try, but we didn't get to, ASUS actually has a dash LAN card, which basically is a little NIC port that you put on, kind of PCIe slot, like boom, plop it in there. And then it also has a little SM bus header. And the idea is that provides out of band management, which I just thought was like, whoa, that is super cool. I really want to go try that one day, but we just didn't have the card, so I can't really show that to you. But hopefully one day we'll be able to show that to you, at least on the STH main site. But that really gets to the idea of remote manageability. We'll talk about more of the ASUS management solution when we get to that a little bit later. Okay, but let's take this thing up a notch or two, because sure, that's a little system, I get it looks nice, cool, whatever, but let's go do something that's like fun, right? Because, a lot of people think that just because this is a CSM model and just because, it doesn't have all the fancy heat sinks, you can't really do anything fun with it. But I definitely don't think that's the case, and I'm gonna show you what we did. So the first thing I did is said, hey, well, 64 gigabytes of memory is good, but this thing can take up to 128 gigs. So let's go max that out. And so we put another two 32 gig DIMMs in, so we have a total of 128 gigabytes of memory in here. For the vast majority of corporate desktops, that is way too much. but I just wanted to go and try it out. And then the other thing was that ASUS sent one of these. They sent a NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3060, so 12 gigabyte card. So that's kind of why we have so much memory in here, because we actually had a 12 gigabyte GPU, and I was like, well, we can't have like, 8 gigabytes of memory and then have a 12 gigabyte GPU. Like, that would be crazy. So that's why we have 128 gigs or 64 gigs to start out with. And so that is the total reason for that. But this is a pretty decent GPU. And really one of the kind of cool things was this just barely fits the Fractal Node 304 chassis that we have this in. So, I mean, there is just a little bit of clearance. Sure, maybe there's a little bit more, but it is basically right to the edge. And so just something to note, that is one of the reasons that we got the larger chassis, because we knew we were going to go do this. But the reason that we're using the Fractal 304 is because if you look on the other side, opposite the motherboard where the power supply goes, you'll actually see that we can put a total of 8 hard drives there. And I said, wait, what if we went and we put over 100 terabytes of storage? And because we had a total of 6 of the 18 terabyte WD HC550, so kind of more of the kind of like higher end drives, I was like, well, why don't we use those? Because that gives us over 100 terabytes. And so we plugged all those into the system, but then we only had 4 motherboard headers. So what we actually did was added a little card with an onboard SATA controller. We had another model where we had 4 kind of SSDs, but then these were too small and they didn't really make sense. And like, why are we using such a big case? So we're not actually showing that config. The other one that we had that we're not really showing is that we also had a 2.5 gig Ethernet adapter that we added on along with Wi-Fi modules, but then we again couldn't use the add-in SATA controller, so we couldn't use all of the hard drive spaces in the back. So that was just a trade-off that we made, that we're actually going to present this model, but we totally did this and it totally worked. And another thing we did try, and I'll just say this, is that we also tried the Intel Core i7 12700F, but since I'm Mr. Acceleration, we're still using the Core i5, and just frankly, I think that in a lot of the corporate desktops, that Core i5 is like the absolute sweet spot, and so that's why we're using it here. So let's talk about the big thing that I think changed when we added all the extra components. So when we started out, we had an idle power consumption in the system of about 22 watts or so before we added everything. And a big part of that is just the fact that we do have 3 fans. We have an 850 watt 80 plus gold EVGA power supply. And so the power supply is way too big for the system if it doesn't have GPU and the hard drives and stuff. And also, we have 3 fans that we really don't need that many fans for just kind of the base config. And so that 22 watts was probably even on the high side, but at the same time, it was not too bad. Once we added all the hard drives and once we added the GPU and the new SATA controller, all that kind of stuff, we ended up at about 66 watts. But overall, adding all this other stuff also added, I think it was like about 210 watts or 220 watts to the overall power consumption of the system. So it's definitely, we're definitely paying for all the extra stuff just in terms of what we kind of saw, kind of the maximum power consumption. So just gonna keep that in mind, that if you do add more stuff, you are gonna have more power. But on the flip side, I mean, hey, we got a GPU, we got over 100 terabytes of storage, and we also have a total of 128 gigabytes of memory. I mean, this is absolutely a very cool system. And the reason I wanted to do that was just to show the fact that just because this is a, corporate desktop PC that doesn't have RGB and all that ornamentation on it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't build something that is interesting, especially if you have clients that need something a little bit different. Maybe they need a NVIDIA GPU for a software package, or, the acceleration that you get. So maybe they need that. Maybe they need a lot of storage because maybe this is just the only PC that's in a business, and like they need their local surveillance cameras to be stored somewhere and Blue Iris to be running. And if that's the case, well, you can go put 100 plus terabytes of storage on there and like record away, like however much you want, right? And the other thing I just want to note is that ASUS actually has a whole management console. And so if you have a whole bunch of these systems, you have to actually turn on some agent stuff, so onto the client PCs that have it. But you do get things like, you can see things like chassis intrusion. So you can see if somebody's trying to like open up and, steal components, which actually does happen, businesses. So you can kind of see that kind of stuff. You can see things like, if things are like powering off incorrectly. So you get like error logs and event logs and stuff like that. And you can also see things like update status on the BIOS. And so there's like corporate manageability stuff that you get with that management console, and you get to see it all in one place. So you can see if there's something that is having a problem. So overall, I hope you liked this look at the CSM, or corporate stable model. It's something that, we really don't get to review a lot anymore. I mean, the last time we did it was like 8-9 years ago. But at the same time, it's also not the most exciting. I mean, people like to gravitate towards the the gaming PCs because they have blinky lights and they're kind of exciting like that. But if you're a business user, you don't necessarily want all that RGB. You kind of want something that's stable, that has, you know, a guaranteed supply chain, that you're going to get an end of life notice so you know when you're going to have to switch things up. You also want things like the ability to manage these things out of band. You want TPM features. You want all of that kind of stuff that is really focused on the business motherboard side rather than on the consumer side. So you actually see that this motherboard, I think I was looking at it online and it was like somewhere in the $160, $170 range. And that is more than some of ASUS's gaming like B660M motherboards that they have in other segments. But the flip side to it is that you are getting all these other features. And I think a lot of folks just kind of look at this motherboard and they're just like, well, it doesn't have fancy heat sinks on it, so I'm not going to buy that one. But if you are building a PC for a client or for, you know, your own company, you might want to actually go look at something that is kind of built for that purpose, and especially more so than what we had seen many years ago. And if you do want to go build a really cool system out of it, you can totally go do that too. And hey, if you like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.